Everybody, thanks for coming along at the tasting today. Today we're going to do a Garnacha Masterclass. I'll introduce myself briefly. My name's Norrel Robertson. I'm a winemaker and a vineyard owner in Spain. We currently own about 35 hectares of mainly old vine Grenache. And we've been living in Spain approximately about 18 years now. So in the last 18 years, we started our own business in 2004. The company's called El Escoces Balanci, and slowly but surely we sort of built up all these old amazing vineyards, which, you know, what's what turns us over a profit these days, what keeps us going, and really what I'm most passionate about. Obviously you can tell from my accent I'm Scottish, but I studied winemaking and viticulture in New Zealand, in Lincoln, and after working as a cellar hand and a winemaker in various parts around the world, in 2003 I arrived in Spain. I was working for a company called International Wine Services at the time, and I was making wine in Bordeaux, in the Languedoc-Roussillon, and also in Campo de Borja, Calatayud, Navarra, La Mancha. And essentially I picked a map up with my wife, and we decided that Calatayud was the most central point for my work. So what I would like to say, it's a great privilege to be here today to talk about Garnacha, because it really is my kind of #1 passion in life. Before we start tasting the wines, what I would encourage you all to do is to, if you've got 6 glasses, put each wine in every glass. What I've noticed in the last few minutes, just after pouring the wines, is that they are starting to open up now. So I'd encourage you to get them in your glasses just now. I'm going to take you through about 10 or 15 slides just on the history of Garnacha in Spain, how it responds in the vineyards, how it responds in the winery, and then we'll move into the tasting. So let's start going through the slides. So I think in today's climate, where people are worried about climate change, water needs, I mean, Grenache is one of the real kind of positive stories for Spain, in the sense that it really is a variety that responds well to drought conditions. Okay, it's no surprise that we find so much of it planted in Spain and all over Spain, whether that's in Gredos in the centre, in continental Spain, in Aragon, where I live, or indeed in the Mediterranean, in places like Montsant, Priorat, or Terra Alta. From that, we could also say it's an eco-friendly grape with its adaptability to drought. And also, it doesn't really suffer too much from disease pressure. I would say that, where I live at the moment, we have about maybe 200 millimeters of rain a year. Maybe the wetter parts of Spain, they might have to get 400, 500, but really we don't have too much in the way of mildew, oidium, botrytis. In terms of how it behaves in the vineyard, it does lend itself to staying in the ground for a long time. It doesn't suffer too much from wood diseases. In terms of the way it grows, it's a very vertical plant, okay? So if you want to compare it to a different variety like Syrah, for example, which tends to sprawl all over the place, you actually find that Grenache has this tendency to be very vertical. And as a result, you do tend to find most of it planted as bush vine. So it's very economical grape to maintain in that respect. It doesn't usually need a trellis system. So from a grower's perspective, it's very, very manageable. Moving on a little bit, if we think about what the grape has itself and also what the wine goes on to have, it tends to be quite low in tannin compared to other varieties like Cabernet and Merlot, or other Spanish varieties, say Graciano or Tempranillo. It also tends to have low anthocyane and colour content. We will see in the red wines we taste today a little bit of variation in colour, and we can explain that little by little depending on each climate and each wine. It's a late ripening variety in the sense that it needs a long window, a long vegetative cycle to get ripe. It actually buds before grapes like Tempranillo, so one of the big factors we have here is a risk of frost. Certainly, we all heard about the frost in France in the last 2 or 3 weeks, and that has also touched many places of Spain as well. We've probably lost in some of our older vineyards this year, maybe up to 10 or 15%. And that's just from the last 2 or 3 weeks. So I have the saying in Spain, basically they say, don't put away your overcoat till the 40th of May. And that's very much the case when you come to grow Garnacha. We can probably suffer from frost up until the 7th to the 10th of May. So we're almost out of that risk now. So hopefully the weather's going to be nice and well, mild for the next few weeks. In terms of flavour and physiological ripeness, it's very rare to find Grenache under 13.5% alcohol. Usually the flavours tend to accumulate as you get later on the cycle. So usually the wines tend to have maybe 14, sometimes 15, sometimes 16% alcohol. Yield sensitive, what I want to mean by this is that you know, the lower yield you have, the more concentration you have, and usually the more character you have. And obviously, as we've seen with the focus on old vines around the world at the moment, there is a big quality differentiation between a vineyard that's 3 or 5 years old and then something that gets up to 15 or 20 or 30, 35 years old. That's when you really start to feel character in a grape variety. Talking about the kind of other components of the wine, it tends to have very nice high acidity and a low pH. So from a winemaking perspective, you can be quite hands-off. You don't need to acidify. It really is a glorious grape variety to work with in that respect. Moving on to the next slide. So what's happening at the moment in Spain? Well, there's more of a focus on quality rather than quantity. I think traditionally it was considered as a workhorse variety that went into big blends. It was also shipped around Spain and other parts of Europe to fortify wine, if you like, to give it a bit more body and alcohol. But the positive thing for me in the last few years, we've seen a lot more focus on clonal selection based on smaller berries, more concentration, more character rather than high yields. What's fascinating to me about Garnacha, I guess, and we'll see it in these wines as we go through them, is the whole context of aroma. And as you know, if you look at other varieties, whether it's Cabernet Sauvignon, Sauvignon Blanc, these are varieties that are Shiraz, that have a very defined character that comes from 2 or 3 flavour aromas. In the case of Garnacha, what tends to happen is that you have these myriads of flavours. It's almost like Pinot Noir for me. There's some technical elements on the sheet here, but the most important compounds are things like beta-ionone, which sometimes can smell like violets or raspberries, sometimes tropical fruit. But the main kind of reservoir of precursors or aromas that you have in Garnacha are based on these C13 beta-carotene substances, okay? So what you tend to find with Grenache, and I give you this parallel that you all find with Riesling as well, when you have maybe too much sunlight coming into the canopy, into the grape, you tend to produce wines that are a little bit more heavy, a little bit more oily. So in the same way that you would say a Riesling will develop a bit more quickly from a warmer climate, like Australia and New Zealand, than it will in Germany, a lot of that comes from the fact that you have more of a shaded light, or you have less radiation, basically, if you like. And the same thing happens with Grenache. So in terms of how you manage it in the vineyards, it's very, very important to get the right amount of foliage and the right amount of leaf cover on your grapes. You don't leave them too exposed, otherwise the wines just tend to be a little bit too flabby and they lose a lot of character as well. Moving on, one thing that I find fascinating for me is the idea of how calcium plays a role in the formation of compounds. And I think you will see this when you come to taste Grenaches that come from more limestone soils. When we come to the wine from Navarra today, I think you'll find it's got a very particular aroma, which comes from very much the elevation of the vineyards and the soils that they have as well. So depending whether Grenache comes from slate, from granite, from limestone soils, from stony soils, you will see a completely different picture of aromas. So in general, responds better on low potential soils with little vigor, soils that are well drained, okay? I think the major thing that Garnacha suffers from in the vineyard is botrytis. So you really want to keep your humidity down. And as I said before, you need this good mix of, you know, keeping the bunches exposed so you don't encourage fungal diseases, but at the same time having this kind of dappled leaf and some shading on the grapes so the wines don't become too alcoholic and too oily. And here, just some figures for you I wanted to put in just to show you where Grenache has gone historically. This is a slide from the University of Rioja from a winemaker and producer called Juan Carlos Sancha. And if we look back to the early 70s in 1973, Grenache represented, you know, almost 40% of the vineyards in Rioja. By 2012, that had come down to just under 9%. So A lot of that was to do with the growth of Tempranillo in the Rioja vineyards. I think people, or some of the larger companies in Rioja in the 1970s, cottoned on to the fact that Tempranillo could probably give you a few more kilos than Grenache could. And again, this slide's quite interesting as well. I'll just show you the evolution of the number of grape varieties in Rioja as well over the years. So say 109, 110 years ago, we had 44 different grape varieties present in present in Rioja. That went down all the way down to 7 in 2000. So that just gives you an idea of how, as human beings, we've kind of lost a little bit of biodiversity in the vineyard around the world, and in Spain also. I like this kind of little diagram here because it sums up quite neatly the effect between yield and vine age. Okay, so usually younger vines, higher yielding vines made from Grenache usually tend to find vines more destined towards rosé production. Then once you get yields up to maybe 4 or 5 tons per hectare, you're looking at Grenache that enters into blends. And then, this kind of expression of pure Grenache, which I find very enticing, is that you really do find this amazing character and complexity when you get into yields that are maybe 2 or 3 tons per hectare, and vineyards which are over 20 years old. So this little kind of schematic triangle is a very neat way of thinking about how Grenache performs in the vineyard. Okay. I mean, there are certain theories about where Garnacha originated from. Myself living in Aragon and being an adopted Aragonese, I'm very much of the belief that it did adapt itself very well to the Iberian mountain system where I live. And certainly this map is based on the kingdom of Aragon from the 14th and 15th century and where Grenache essentially spread to. So from Aragon, it spread out to the Mediterranean, to places like Catalonia, then the Mediterranean Sea, Sardinia, into Italy. And, you could almost find Grenache as far afield as places like Greece and Israel. So that's something that we have to be grateful for, I think, in Spain, that the Catholic kings at that time managed to extend the Grenache all the way through their empire, if you like. This is a little shot from an archaeological dig about a village about 7 kilometers from where I live in Canataud. And this was an old lagar which was discovered in this dig, and they did DNA testing on the seeds. They did carbon dating on the seeds as well, and essentially they discovered that Garnacha was being cultivated 200 years before Christ was born. So there's probably the theory then that the Romans, when they came into Aragon, they then took it into the Roman Empire as well, up into France. So I don't want to disparage the French, but the French do have a habit of taking on Garnacha or Grenache as its own variety. But we really, I think we can consider that Aragon was really the true birthplace of the variety. So talking a little bit about Garnacha in the 20th century, phylloxera, came through most of Spain from the 1890s through to 1910. And I guess that was the kind of first reduction in the amount of Garnacha vineyards that we have in Spain. So typically what happened is that once we had American rootstocks, people would plant the rootstocks and they would actually graft in the vineyards, okay? And that went on for a long, long time, I would say up until the 1980s. In the 1980s, you had the development of some of the more popular French clones at the time, like clone 70 or clone 224. And they were clones really that favoured yield over quality. So that's when maybe Grenache went into a bit of a slump in terms of its quality issues. And that kind of coincided with 2 very important things for Spain at the same time, one of which was the entry into the European community. So, all of a sudden from 1986 onwards, Spanish grape growers were being encouraged to grow up their vineyards by receiving grants from the European community. At the same time, you had this internationalization of the vineyard. So we had the planting of Chardonnay, Cabernet, Merlot, which happened all over the world, but it also hit Spain very hard because all of a sudden the commercial impulse was to sell wines made from these international varieties, and Grenache struggled as a result. I guess just to give you a figure, I think, pre-entry to the European community, Spain probably had about 170,000 hectares of Garnacha planted. That went down to about 65,000 in 2003. So we probably lost about 2/3 of our Garnacha patronage, if you like. So I guess my work in Spain has been to champion the grape variety, save a lot of old vineyards, and to kind of keep the Garnacha story going, if you like. The positives after that, I guess, was that after the 80s, we started to get some nice clonal selections. So there was a lot of regional selection based around Navarra, Aragon, Castilla y Leon also. And I think by the time we got to about 2010, places like the University of Pamplona, Navarra had stored 2,000 different biotypes, germoplasma based on Garnacha. And I say it's been ongoing. A lot of the positive work that's been done in Spain has been led by more forward-thinking nurseries who are now going out into old vineyards and putting together a lot of massal selections that you can now plant when you want to plant new vineyards. So I think there's a whole lot of positive stuff going on there. We're getting back to our roots, if you like, in terms of having this biodiversity based around Grenache or Garnacha. So I think that's enough of the kind of context, or hopefully putting Garnacha into context. So I think let's start tasting the first wine, okay? Which is a white wine from Terra Alta. And talking about Terra Alta a little bit, this is the part of Spain where we have the largest concentration of Garnacha Blanca. So the Terra Alta is the most southern denomination in Catalonia, which borders Aragon. It's quite interesting because I would say it has a cross between a Mediterranean and a continental climate. And if you look at these statistics here, they're in Spanish, but it's pretty easy to understand that Terra Alta has 90% of all Garnacha Blanca grown in Catalonia and 75% of all the Garnacha Blanca planted in Spain. And I think if you want to go at a global level, I think Terra Alta probably represents almost 30% of the global level of Garnacha Blanca, which is quite interesting. It's a variety that probably fell out of favor in other parts of Spain because of its sensitivity to things like botrytis. But for me, I think it's an amazing variety. If we pick up this first glass and taste it at the moment, this is from a winery, quite a new winery called Herencia Altes. And this is a partnership, it's a husband and wife partnership between Nuria Altes and Rafael Dahan. And they've built a very nice winery, an ecologically friendly winery based on solar power in the Terra Alta. So, and this is quite an interesting take on the variety. I mean, for me, it's just got all those lovely things that you come to expect from Garnacha Blanca. It's not the most, you're not going to get the same level of intensity you get from a Verdecho or a Sauvignon Blanc, but for me, it's got these really lovely, subtle, pithy aromas to it. I would say like a citric pithiness on the finish, but on the nose, for me, good Garnacha Blancas, they always give you that kind of note of bergamot, orange blossom, almost like a kind of meloso wine, I would say, using the Spanish description. And on the palate, it's very unctuous, it's very creamy. The way they've made this wine, it's quite interesting because they whole bunch press grapes that they pick in 20-kilo cases into the press, and then they sacrifice quite a lot of juice in the press. They only use the kind of free run juice that comes out of this. They allow a little bit of juice oxidation on this, and what that does long term, it just makes the wine a lot more stable. So any of the oxidizable substrate in the wine is quickly oxidized at the juice stage. Then when the wine is actually aged on lees for 3 months and goes into bottle, it's a lot more stable. So in a way, you sacrifice a little bit of varietal character, but you just get this amazing creaminess, lots of levels of complexity going on this wine. So it'd be interesting to see your comments. I think now you can scan the QR code on your bottle and it'll bring up the technical sheet. This is a wine that I think it's about 13.5% alcohol, but it's not unusual to find Garnacha Blanca up at 14.1, 14.2% alcohol. Very much responds in the same way as Garnacha Tinta. The flavors come quite late in the day in terms of the ripening cycle. And I think, it's a variety that we're seeing more of again. Certainly speaking to nurseries around Spain, there's a lot more planting material available than we had 10 or 15 years ago. We have a little bit that we're planting. The other variety that we're not going to taste today is Garnacha Gris, or the grey Grenache, or sometimes known as the grape of the dead, because it's got quite a peculiar colour. If you've ever seen Pinot Grigio or Gewürztraminer, the skins have this kind of like almost like rosé kind of brown colour to it. And the locals around my neck of the woods, they call it the grape of the dead. But I think Garnacha Gris is also a variety to watch. It's something that for me gives even more texture, more structure, not just in blends but as a single variety as well. So I'm just reading some of the comments just now on this wine, and someone is rightly saying that Arentia Altes also make a very good Garnacha Peluda. Okay, so Garnacha Peluda means hairy Grenache, and that's the grape itself is hairy, but it means that it's got hairs on the underside of the leaf. If you ever look at a Grenache vine or the Grenache leaf, it's very, very deep green in colour, and usually on the underside of the leaf there's no hair. Okay, so that's what you would consider Garnacha Tinta, but you do have a mutation of Garnacha Tinta, which is called Garnacha Peluda, where you have this hairiness on the underside of the leaf as well, and it's a variety that you find probably more in places like Catalonia, Terra Alta, and you also find Garnacha Peluda in places like the Roussillon in the south of France. So yeah, I'd be interested just to read your comments on this wine. I mean, as Simon Wood says here, yeah, he's coming with the French translation, Lunar Pelut. So yeah, if you guys are happy to move on to the first red, let's move on to the first red. Okay, all right. So this for me, I think, is one of the most exciting Garnachas I've tried in a long time, because it really doesn't fit the conventional mold of what we typically think about of Garnacha. Garnacha for me has become quite a wide faith and a wide church in the last 10 or 15 years. So now we have the Navarreros Garnacha from Bernabéu, which is situated around the village of San Martín de Valdeiglesia in Gredos. This comes from various vineyard plots, which are fermented in lots and lots of different ways. They ferment some of this in stainless steel, they ferment some of it in oak, they ferment some of it in concrete as well. But what I love about this wine is just, if you pick it up and look at the colour of it, it's just, it reminds me almost more of, something you'd expect from the Côte de Beaune or a high quality Pinot Noir. And that kind of impression follows through onto the palate as well, and the nose. I mean, it's what you would call an infusion based type of winemaking. Okay, this kind of elegant color and this really kind of vibrant nose really comes from treating the wine from a winemaker's point of view without too much extraction. So basically they might just plunge this wine once or twice in its fermentation, but it's really all about percolation and an infusion of flavors. It's almost citric, notes of rosehip. It's really one of the most elegant wines that I've tried in Spain quite recently. And this is not an expensive wine. I think it's maybe 12 to 15 quid a bottle, depending on where you are. Obviously, I don't live in the UK anymore, but I think we can pick this up in Spanish retail for about 13 euros. So going back to this idea of having different amounts of colour in Garnacha Tinta, part of it comes from the winemaking protocol on this wine, but a lot of it comes from the fact that the type of soil that we have here in Gredos. Okay, so what we're talking about here is decomposed granite, and that kind of changes the way the variety performs a little bit. You tend to get less color accumulation because of these granite soils. You have a little bit more reflection of sunlight coming back off the soil into the canopy. And it probably means this is a continental climate, but I would probably, hedge a bet that they're probably picking their grapes maybe 10 to 15 days before we are here in Aragon. So despite the fact that they've got altitude, this decomposed granite soil tends to mean that the maturity comes on a little bit more quickly. You have a little less color in the Garnacha, but at the same time, you have these absolutely amazing, intriguing aromas to me. So, a great example of continental style Grenache from granite soils. And on the palate, this wine is just so smooth, enticing. What you get in the nose is essentially following through. I know you guys are drinking this in the UK. I probably might have should have cooled this down a little bit more, but for me, it's one of those red wines that really benefits from being slightly chilled a little bit. So, have we got any comments on our Gredos Garnacha here? Everyone's being quite quiet. So Simon's saying older wines would be other grapes in the vineyard. I mean, there's a bit of conflicting information on the fiche techniques. I have the kind of, it says here on the fiche technique that they're working with Albio and Muscatel de Grano Menudo as well. I'm not sure if that's just a statement of the varieties they work with, or actually there's been some white varieties ended up in this wine as well. But talking about the age of these vineyards, you probably look at an average age of 40 years plus, between 40 to 80 years old. And you do get this amazing concentration and length on this wine. Are we happy to move on to our second red? Yeah. Okay. This next slide really concerns wine number 3 and wine number 5. I just wanted to illustrate that we do have lots and lots of different climatic influences and what shapes Garnacha in Spain. So if you look at areas in this map like Rioja and Navarra, they're obviously quite close to this Atlantic influence and Cantabrian influence, if you like, you know. So sometimes we have this concept of Grenache being this big, bold beast, but really what we're going to come across now in this next wine is something completely different. So our second red is the Contino Garnacha from Rioja. Okay, so the Contino winery is situated in the Alavesa, but not too far from Rioja Alta also. And what I love about this next wine is that it kind of sums up both Rioja and Garnacha in very, very positive ways. We're looking at a wine that, as soon as you put it on the nose, it takes you to Rioja, but it takes you to Garnacha at the same time. And I think, if I'm right, this is the first vintage that was made by Jorge Navasquez, who's the head winemaker at Contino. Jorge is a guy who comes from a long line of very famous winemakers in Aragon. His father was probably responsible for making half of the wine made from Garnacha in Aragon back in the day, and Jorge has done an amazing job as a winemaker, is continuing his family tradition, and not only makes great wines where I live in Aragon, but also makes some great wines for the Cune group, especially in Contino, and he's also involved in winemaking as far afield as Valdoris and Galicia. So for me, you know, great wine, also, you know, great to show a wine from a friend of mine that I admire hugely as a winemaker. But on the nose, what I love about it is it's not too dominated by oak. I mean, what I tried to do today with the selection of these wines was to, you know, select Garnachas that are not too overly oaked, and I think they've just got the oak on this wine spot on. I mean, aromatically, you get a little bit of the cinnamon, nutmeg, the spice, which is coming from the French oak, but I think this only spent about 10 months in barrels, and it was a combination of French oak of varying sizes. Then it goes back into cement to kind of age for another month or two before it goes into bottle. 2018, quite an interesting vintage. I mean, the first 3 reds we're tasting here are all from the same vintage, but quite different in terms of character. Certainly 2018 in Gredos was probably, although this wine's got 14.5% alcohol, the Gredos wine is quite light. The Contino Rioja were up at 14%. So this just really highlights the point I was making before, that it's very rare to get Garnacha Tinta under 13.5% alcohol. Usually for the flavors to come in, you're up at about 14.5. So someone's just picking up on a question here, and this is from Rick Fisher, and he's saying, do you see interest in varietal Garnacha growing in Rioja? I think that's something that's been growing for the last 5 or 10 years. I mean, the real shame about today's tasting is that we've only got an hour and we can only show 6 wines. But I mean, I would have loved to show a 24 wine tasting from Spain on the Pastel and Garnacha. But if you think about Rioja and thinking about the slides that I went back to, on you know, how Garnacha declined in Rioja. You do have 3 or 4 people that are really championing it. So interesting to see Contino bringing out 100% Garnacha. You also have people like Juan Carlos Sancha. He has an amazing range of single vineyard Garnacha wines in the Rioja Alta. And yeah, I think it's a variety that you're going to see more of in Rioja. I think Rioja is a very vibrant, exciting part of Spain at the moment, and it's diversifying tremendously, getting away from the Crianza Reserva Gran Reserva model and moving back to what I would call more of a Burgundian-based model based on village and single vineyards. So yeah, I think you're going to see a lot more single vineyard just coming out of Rioja. But I do love this wine. I think it's absolutely fantastic. Okay, so we have any more questions? Simon Woods, you seem to be the one that's asking all the questions here. But what's interesting, what I'd be interested to ask you guys is, I mean, this is the first time I've done a tasting like this, but I mean, I've been sent a full bottle of each wine, so maybe I'm being a little bit spoiled here, but I'm fascinated how the system works for being sent 100 mils or 200 mils or 50 mils sealed in bottles, and is there any difference between, you know, how that wine tastes in the glass as it would from, say, you know, putting up a full bottle? I mean, I intentionally left these wines open for maybe 30-40 minutes before we started, and I think they're showing really well, but I'm not sure how it responds out of these small sample bottles. Okay, let's move on to one of my wines next, which is La Multa Garnacha. Okay, so now we're coming back to Aragon, the birthplace of Garnacha, and La Multa was kind of like my homage to the Guardia Civil. La Multa in Spanish means the speeding ticket or the driving offence, and I think my first 2 or 3 years based in Spain, I maybe lost 2,000 or 3,000 euros to the Guardia Civil. So La Multa was my vehicle for making some money back from the Spanish government, if you like. But La Multa as a wine is one of these wines you can drink without getting in trouble with the police, and I think it's just a great introduction to old vine Garnacha and Garnacha from where I live in Calatayud. So again, 2018, if we look at the colour on this wine, I think, you know, the first thing you notice is it's got quite a deep core for 100% Garnacha. Again, that's coming from the fact that we're dealing with vineyards at a quite high altitude. Most of these vineyards are situated between 750 and 900 meters, and also coming from the continental aspect of Calatayud. So this is a map that I've just brought up of the comarca of Calatayud, and it's nice to see this relief map because you get a kind of nice idea of the height of the place. So it's essentially you have one major river running through Calatayud, then you have these 4 or 5 tributaries that run into the river Jalón, and then up above each of those river systems you have these very high sierras where most of the vineyards are planted. So, you know, we're 3.5 hours any which direction from the sea, and you have these, you know, fairly amazing old vineyards. And just to give you an idea, the denomination of Calatayud today, we probably have about 3,300 hectares. But when I first moved here to Spain in 2003, I found some old maps from the 1950s, and looking at vineyard plantings, I think we possibly had about 45,000 hectares back in the 1950s, and you know, to drop from you know, 45,000 to 3,000 is quite startling. But what I would say is that this landmass in front of you on the map here, we probably, you know, every single inch of that was covered in vineyards, apart from the valley floors, which were more fruit trees. So you know, very much tasting a wine from the cradle of Garnacha, if you like. On the nose, with respect to the other wines, it's a bit darker as well. You get more of this kind of plummy fruit, a little bit of spice. But essentially, again, we're talking about a wine that's completely unoaked. So in terms of how we treat this wine, it's hand picked, and we ferment in epoxy lined cement. Okay, so it's not raw, it's not crude cement, but it's epoxy lined. And then we do mainly a bit of pigeage, and we don't pump over too much because we want to keep the tannin down. But what I love about this wine is that you get this great contrast of ripe fruit and fresh acidity at the same time. That's really a hallmark of Calatayud for me. They're quite, you know, be quite sort of brutish wines, if you like, and they really kind of sum up the whole nature of the climate around them. Typically, you know, during the day in summer we can get up to 37, 38 degrees, and then at night we will drop 20 or 22 degrees down to 15 or 16 degrees. So that's what really infuses the grapes and the wines with that sort of character, that kind of stark difference between very ripe, powerful fruit and this really fresh acidity on the other side. So a few comments here on the idea that we should have opened up the wines a bit earlier, but anyway, but I hope they're still opening up in the glass. Orange peel-like acidity, Simon Woods. Yeah, I guess it's quite frisky, isn't it? But it's hard to think this wine is just under 15% alcohol. I think it's about 14.95. But for me, you don't pick it too much. I mean, that's one of the beautiful things for me about Grenache, is that you have this power and this amazing acidity going on at the same time. Okay. Any more comments on Calatayud? Are we happy to move on to the next wine? All right, someone is lovely wine. How can supermarkets put out old vine Garnacha from places like here and Campo de Work at £5? Well, I think, you know, a lot of that comes down to the economic, the societal setup of winemaking in somewhere like Aragon and other parts of Spain. You got to understand that I would say that maybe 65% of Spanish wine production is still in the hands of cooperatives. But I'm not sure about £5. I think this wine's probably about 10 quid at the moment. But maybe there are examples out there that are a little bit cheaper. But I don't know. I mean, old vines. I would say that in Calatayud, we probably 70% of the vineyards are over 35 years old. And, you know, there's just people are still planting here after, you know, the disastrous years of grubbing up. So there are vineyards being put back in as well. But yeah, I completely agree with you. I mean, I think part of our job is to try and, you know, convince, you know, the buyer and the consumer to spend more money on these types of wines. I mean, these wines are complete bargains for me. Anything that's under £10 in the UK at the moment, certainly. Well, let's move on to the next wine, and for me, this is like one of the great success stories of Navarra and Spain in the recuperation of old vine Grenache. I remember when I joined the wine trade in the early 90s and buying books from the late 80s on places like Navarra. And, you know, being astounded to think that, you know, back in the day, Navarra was probably 70% based on Garnacha as a denomination. And, you know, as we talked about earlier, the internationalization of the vineyard, people started to plant Cabernet, Merlot, Chardonnay, maybe more Tempranillo as well, that we did lose a lot of great Garnacha vineyards in Navarra. Domaine Lupier, it's a married couple that are behind this wine. I'm sure a lot of you know them, Elisa and Enrique. And these are guys that both worked in the wine trade. Elisa was working in sales and commerce, and her husband was working in the vineyards as a winemaker as well. And they literally bought, I think, about 27 plots of vines within about, I think it was 48 hours. They told me that they got all the paperwork done, and it was all very hush-hush and secret. But, you know, these guys, they only make two wines, the wine we're tasting here, the Terroir and the Dama. And for me, they capture something that's very, very special about the region. It's biodynamically farmed. There's very little intervention in the vineyards, but for me, what really sings here is where the wines come from, the sense of place. So the vineyards are based around a town called Sant Martin de Uncs, which is essentially north of Elite by about 20-30 minute drive. You're getting more of a mountainous area again, But like the Contino wine from Rioja, what you feel in this wine is this real Atlantic influence coming through in the wine. This first opened it earlier was a little bit reduced, but for me it was what I would call a positive reduction. It's that kind of reduction that I really like in red wines. That's almost beguiling, almost smelled to me like a great wine from Neuilly Saint Georges, like a great red Burgundy. And now what I'm getting is this kind of real wild mountain herbs, juniper bushes. This is really one of the most original Garnacha expressions we have in Spain today, I would say, from Domaine Loupier. This is an absolutely cracking wine. And what I love about this wine on the palate is the texture. This is a wine that goes into different sizes of oak barrels, everything from 225s up to Demi-Nuits 600s. But the good thing here is only about 7 or 8% of the barrels are new. And what always continually surprises me about the wines from these guys is that they're some of the longest lived Garnachas that I find on the market. And I think they're very clever at actually releasing their wine onto the market a little bit later than other producers would. This is a 2017, a slightly drier vintage. But for me, I think it's hard to find a better worked Grenache-based wine around the world at the moment at this price point as well. You know, they're not hugely expensive wines, but they've got amazing character to my mind. So we've just got a question coming in from Claire Love here, saying there's a significantly more purple hue on this wine than all the others. What do you attribute this to? I think it's probably down to yields. These guys have got 27 different vineyard plots, but I wouldn't imagine they're harvesting more than an average of 2 tons per hectare. Concentration color coming from the low yield. Also, the climate. You have this big Atlantic influence. It's very fresh. Again, they have the cool nights in Navarra in the same way that we do here in Aragon. So that will help the grapes to hang on to that anthocyanin. It may well be, I'm not sure, that they also do some cold soak on this wine as well. So, you know, by keeping the must in contact with the skins before fermentation, you do tend to extract a little bit more color as well. But yeah, I just think it's a fantastic wine that really kind of shows why Spain is so good at longevity when it comes to Garnacha. When you think about Grenache as a variety in different countries, it's very rare to get this type of precision and intensity from 100% Grenache wines. Usually they need to back up with other varieties, whether that's Mourvèdre or Syrah or Carignan. Interesting comment from Simon there. You're saying on the right side of low sulfur. I think it's quite paradoxical, this wine, because I think you're right. It doesn't feel in the mouth that it has a high sulfur content. For me, wines, whether they're non-sulfur wines or wines, red wines that have little sulfur, they tend to have a different flow and a different mouthfeel in a positive sense of the word. But I also found that I really loved this kind of struck match sulfidic character that I got on the nose when I first opened this wine. And it's a character that I think you can get really wrong as a winemaker when you're trying to push that line to have this really subtle reduction in the wine. But in this wine, it works tremendously well. Yeah. Okay. I think we're doing quite well for time, actually. So, it's always a bit worrying when you've got 15 or 20 slides, and maybe I've rushed through them a little bit too quickly. But we can maybe stay a few more minutes later and talk over the wines, or go backwards if you like. Let's move on to our last wine, which is from Somontano. And for me, I really wanted to put a wine in from Somontano today because sometimes it's a bit of a misunderstood denomination of Spain. I would say maybe like Navarra, it suffered from this wide planting of international varieties when it started as a denomination. This particular wine, the Se Castilla, Old Vine Garnacha from Viñas do Vero, the name Se Castilla comes from the valley in the north of Somontano. It's got 2 lakes either side of it, and it takes its name from Siete Castillos, like it was a Roman terminology for the last outpost that the Romans had in that particular part of Somontano at the time. And if you've never been to Somontano before, I would encourage any of you to go there, because it's one of these really vivid places where the green is really green, the blue is very blue, whether it's the lakes or the hills or whatever. And you know, I fell in love with Somontano the first time I visited there in the late 90s with my wife. But I guess the story for Somontano is that Garnacha always existed as an indigenous variety, especially in places like the Valle Secastia. But essentially what happened, the indigenous varieties, whether it was Garnacha Tinta, Moristel, Parlata, they were grubbed up in favour of things like Chardonnay, Cabernet, Merlot. But having said that, we have a lot of stuff going on in Somontano and also in Huesca at the moment. There's a really nice group called the Vigneron de Huesca, who are focusing back on indigenous varieties. And the work that Viñas del Vero did was quite interesting. I mean, this is essentially vineyards that were planted up to 100 years ago, some of these two parcels that this wine comes from. And in the 1980s and early 90s, they started to recuperate those vineyards and plant the lost vines. If you ever get the chance to go see these vineyards, you can still see hallmarks that they had this polyculture where they used to plant peach trees and almond trees mixed in with the vineyards, and it still has a little bit of that wildness going on. But this, for me, has a lot in common with the previous wine, in the fact that, you know, some people think that Garnacha is a short-lived variety that in bottle that needs to be drunk quickly, and I just think the wines from Secastia, they don't get into their straps until they've got 3 or 4 years bottle age on them. In fact, this wine, I think it picked up the best Spanish Red trophy at the International Wine Challenge going back a few years with their 2012. And you know, I'm always surprised when I drink this wine, whether it's on a wine list in Spain or at wine fairs around the world, when we used to go to wine fairs, that it is still so youthful for a 2016 wine. Again, it's got really quite intense cap and colour to it. On the nose, it's just got this really lovely wild bramble. It's a very pure, concentrated fruit. The winemaking is quite interesting on this wine. It's almost like a kind of Californian thing that they do. They actually crush and de-stem in the vineyard itself, and then they take the crushed must down in these stainless steel containers down to the winery. So it has this kind of natural cold soak going on, if you like, when they pick early morning in the vineyards and crush and de-stem in the vineyard itself. So it's almost something you'd expect to see in the Napa Valley. And, you know, from a winemaking point of view, it maybe doesn't have the kind of personality or the funk of the terroir from Lupier, but for me, it's got great precision, I would say. Maybe more of a technical wine from a winemaking perspective, but very, very well done. Again, I just love this really, really ripe red brambly fruit, but this really bursting acidity going through at the same time. This wine was bottled, I think, in 2018. So yeah, it was aged in oak, mainly larger Allier oak, 500-litre barrels they use there now. And I think, you know, it's probably the wine in the lineup that's got more oak, but I don't find it too, you know, too intense. You know, there's a little bit of drying tannin on the finish from the oak, but I think gastronomically this wine is absolutely sensational as well. So so yeah, that's it. I mean, 6 completely different Garnachas today. I hope you've enjoyed the selection. For me, it was very, very tough putting it together because I was essentially obliged to only choose 6 wines, and we try to be fair to, you know, different distributors in the UK as well, by, you know, trying to choose from a wide array of suppliers in the UK as well. But, you know, I hope it's kind of opened your eyes a little bit to what's out there with Grenache at the moment in Spain and where things are going. And for me, it's been quite fascinating to see the variety evolve. You know, to see the arrival of areas like Gredos coming onto the scene in the last 10 or 15 years, and, you know, getting away from this concept that, you know, Garnacha needs to be, really heavily extracted and then, oak to bejesus. I think the refreshing thing about this tasting today is that all the wines really do mark a sense of place and a sense of identity as well. I guess my only regret was not being able to put in something maybe from the Monsant or the Priorat today. But I just see your comments coming through now. So Simon is asking, is there much Garnacha in the southeast? I take it you mean places like the Levante, Murcia, places like that. Well, I would say that places like Jumilla, Yecla, Buyas, the Dios in Murcia, you're starting to see a lot more Grenache being planted. I'm not convinced they have the best climate down there for it, because what tends to happen, maybe September time, you get a bit more humidity down in the southeast of Spain than what we experience in Aragon, that's for sure, or what you would experience in Gredos. And the only thing I can think about difficult growing Grenache in that part of Spain is that you would certainly have more humidity, you'd have more botrytis risk in the vineyard. Having said that, I mean, you've got people making great wine from Grenache, Casa Castillo, for example, in Murcia. They they do a really good job. I think I'm not sure if they got 100% Garnacha or a blended Garnacha, but they do a good job. And it's something I think that if you get the vineyard balanced right, if you get the yields right, you can make amazing Garnacha in lots of different places. And I think, as I said at the introduction of the tasting today, with climate change, I think you're going to see Garnacha becoming more important as a grape variety, which is where it should be. So yeah. Anyway, okay, guys. I think that's about it for me. If there are any other questions, please fire in. It's been a bit of a kind of quick fire thing. For those that know me, don't know me, I hope to see you again, either in Spain or in the UK, and hopefully with a glass of Garnacha in my hand. So thanks very much for coming today. And I would just to say this is the second of 6 tastings that are going on with wines from Spain. So I'm not sure if more of you are signed up to other things, but I would certainly encourage it. It's been a new thing for me. I get the sensation I'm just going through a monologue because I can't hear people responding back to me. But it's been a pleasure to share a little bit of my passion, what I'm involved with, and keep the Grenache flag flying, I would say. Thank you very much.